Okay, so today I'm going to try to make a new function for our ostrich class that detects complete AABB collision with a vulture class object. And it needs to do two things, or we need to write the function that determines whether or not we're colliding with a vulture, and then we need to then do some stuff with that function, which is if we collide, then we check the x position and compare it, and then either the x's are going to be equal, which means we revert our dx for each object, or one of the objects is higher, in which case the player's higher, vulture needs to turn in egg. If vulture's higher, player needs to turn into explosion and reset its position. So it's going to be a little tricky to implement, but I know exactly, it's not a question of knowing how to do it. It's just a question of doing it, because it's pretty straightforward to me. So instead of these two, we need a bonus right collides. And it's almost like that should be called left collide platform or something. So the thing is, it's because of the buffer. It's because of the buffer that we have to rewrite this function. Because if it only detects a collision upon the ostriches being within that buffer zone, it's not going to trigger appropriately. So we really do need to sorry guys. Okay, whatever. Let's do this. We're going to write a function for our ostrich that is called right collide enemy. Because the idea here is we're not checking to see if the vulture is colliding with the ostrich. We're checking to see if the ostrich collides with the enemy. So we can get away with calling this function right collide enemy that takes in an enemy entity. And guys, I'm sorry this is so late. I really want to. I'm so tired of yawning through these. Like, I'll just put it off until this late, which shouldn't be the case. So here's how we write a AABB collision. And I'm going to try to do this without looking at any of this stuff. Checking to see if our ostrich's left side is... so there's two ways of doing it. We can detect if a collision is impossible and return false, or we can detect if it is a collision and return true. I guess we kind of got to do both anyway. So we're going to see if our left side of the ostrich is smaller than the enemy's x plus enemy's width. So if it's smaller than the right side of our enemy, and it's greater than the left side of our enemy, meaning it's in between. Our X would be in between the ostriches or the vultures X, because I'm saying, hey, X has got to be smaller than the right side of the enemy, meaning it's got to be to the left of the enemy's right side, but it's got to be on the right side of the leftmost side of our enemy, if that makes any sense. So we check for the X, then we check for the Y. We say if our ostrich's Y is our ostrich's Y is smaller than our enemy's Y plus our enemy's height, so you know, the top of our ostrich has to be smaller than the bottom of our enemy's bottom, but it has to be bigger than the topmost part of our enemy. And if both of those cases are true, if both the X is colliding and the Y is colliding, then we return a true. And then we don't need an otherwise, because if we return true, it'll be true, and then if it's not, it'll ultimately return false, because it can only be true or false. So either it meets the conditions for true or it's just false. So I think that's right. So we're saying if the leftmost side of our ostrich is smaller than the right side of the enemy, and our left side of the ostrich is greater than the enemy's left side, then if our ostrich's top side is smaller than the bottom of our enemy and the top side of our ostrich is greater than the top side of our enemy, then it would be a collision. I think that's true. And then so the thing is here, this logic is going to be the same for both our left collide and our right collide. But so here's the thing. You would think that if we're just using the same logic for both sides, we can just get away with only using one function called side collide with enemy that takes in an enemy entity, or object rather. But that's not exactly the case, because so is there so my thinking for not doing just a general side collision is because if we're facing a different direction, like let's say, I guess my question is, can vultures ever fly backwards like we can? And I don't think they can. But if our butt is flying towards a vulture, and our butt flying towards it means we're facing the opposite direction, if we side collide, would it be different depending on which side we collide with? So you know what, maybe we don't need left and right. We just need one side collide with an enemy function. Because if we side collide on the incorrect side, it still should return the same output, which is collision true, and then check the X position? Well, no, because if we collide here, let me see in the original. So the thing is, let's say we're flying towards, like if this is our jousts sticks, this is the ostrich, this is the vulture. If we right collide with an enemy and we're higher, the enemy should turn into an egg. But if we're facing this way and we collide and our ostrich is higher, do we die because our butt got hit by a joust even though we're higher? And I think the case is yes, we should die. Let me see if that's the case. So I want to see if we can fly into a vulture that is facing us. Oopsie. But oh my god. Basically I want to see if we're higher than a vulture but we're facing the other direction. Oh yeah, we do kill him. So we can kill him with only our ass. Which, yeah, we can kill him with only our ass. We don't need to kill him with, we don't need to kill him with our joust, so our lance. So I guess that tells me we don't really need two different functions here. We just need a side collide with enemy function. And we just check the X position upon the collision to check what we need to do. So we can say that this is called a side collide enemy. And the difference, I could just call it side collide, which there's a difference between a side collide and a left collide or a right collide, because this can only take in a collidable platform. And instead of calling this collidable, we should probably call it collidable platform to be verbose about it. Because even though a collidable will have an X, a Y, a width, and a height, we're not passing in any enemies to this function. So I guess it just comes down to the semantics of how clear we want to be. But I think for this case, I'm just going to put side collide enemy. That takes in an enemy parameter. So as far as this function's concerned, an enemy parameter needs an X, a width, a Y, and a height, which all enemies do have that. But if they didn't have that, we would get some errors, but we have that. So if this is checking so look, this is the colliding through platforms loop. So here we should put our check enemy collision. So we're going to say if our ostrich side collide, I feel like it should be side collides, because we have left collides, right collides, side collides enemy that takes in an enemy. So the thing is, our enemy at the moment is only one, and it's a vulture one, but eventually it'll be just like our platforms, where we assign all of our objects into a table of collidable platforms. Therefore, we can iterate through and check for collision on each and every enemy instance. But for now, we're just going to code in the one enemy because we don't have that table just yet. But we'll remember. It'll just be another thing we gotta implement once we get it working. So we're saying the enemy that gets passed in is a vulture 1. So this is checking on our player 1. Hey, does player 1 return a true on this side collides enemy with a vulture 1 passed in? And if it is true, then we need to check X position. And then otherwise do nothing. So I guess we just leave that out. So we're gonna say if self.x is smaller than vulture 1.x, meaning it's higher, then we need to explode vulture, turn into egg, turn vulture into egg. And then otherwise, that if we're colliding and our x is not smaller than the x, the vulture 1's x, then that means it would be, we need the equals. So we need to first see, maybe we first see, hey, if our x's are equal, then we need to, we need to reverse objects dx, and then else if self.x is smaller than vulture 1.x, that means player wins. Well, I should call it if self.x is smaller than vulture 1.x, that means our lance or our ass is higher than the vulture's x. Then actually, hold on. Yeah. When I first thought about implementing this, I thought we'd have to find out how high our lance is, but we really just need to check the x position. Because it says highest lance wins, but if we just check our x, that means the highest lance, you know? So if our x is smaller than vulture 1, then we need to explode vulture into egg, and then else, that would mean the vulture wins, and then we would need to explode player explodes. So upon collision, there's only 3 instances. Either we can have the same x, in which case we reverse our dx, like we bump into each other and turn, right? The other scenario is our x is smaller than the vulture's x, which means we turn vulture into egg. And the last possibility is if our x is greater than the vulture x, meaning the vulture is higher than us, and that would mean we explode. Yeah. So, reversing our dx. Now, one thing I'm thinking about is, let's say a vulture's flying to the right and I'm chasing it to the right. And then by the time I collide with it, our x is exactly the same height. In that case, what do we want to happen? We would probably want the vulture to die because we're hitting them in the butt with our joust. But in this scenario, I would be reversing our dx instead, which means if we're chasing a vulture and we collide with it while our x's are equal, it would turn our vulture into moving left and it would turn us into moving left instead of both of us moving right. And that just wouldn't make any sense. But if we're flying towards one another and we collide on the same x, it would make sense that our dx would reverse. So maybe we have to see, vulture does have a boolean called facing right, right? Yes, it does. So I think we need to say, we need to do another if, saying if self dot facing right and vulture 1 dot facing right, if we're facing the same direction and our x is the same, then I would say that we should turn ostrich into egg, or turn vulture into egg. Explode vulture into egg. Else if the same case, if we're both moving left and a collision is detected and our x's are the same. So also, or else if not self facing right and not vulture 1 facing right, then same deal. Is there a more succinct way of saying this? We need to say, I wonder if we can evaluate a Boolean with an equality operator, right? Because we're going to say if self.facing right equals vulture 1 dot facing right. If they're both facing right, it should evaluate to true, at which case we'd explode vulture into egg. But if it's false, we'd be asking if self.facing right, which would be false. So it's asking if false and false, which would be true. Fuck. I don't know if I can do that. For now, I'm going to try what I've got, and then once I get it working, I'm going to see if I can see if you can evaluate facing right as Boolean to compare if they are same, and by they, if vulture Boolean is same. Okay, and then so yeah, if any AABB collisions detected between our player and this vulture, there's only 3 things that can happen. we can either be x equals x smaller or x higher. And if it's equals, if we're facing the same direction, we explode the vulture. If we're facing the same direction, we explode the vulture. That's why I want to see if we can do this. Evaluating Boolean, because they're kind of the same thing. We're just asking if these two are the same. So it's like I'm actually asking, is this true and this true? If so, this. And then here I'm asking, is this false and is this false? Then do this. So I'm really asking, are these the same Boolean? That's why I'm calling this, see if I can evaluate it as Boolean. And then okay. So we also need to, we need to reverse objects dx if we're not facing the same direction. Yeah, if we're facing each other and we bump and our x's are the same, we need to reverse our dx, which will flip us. So we need to say self.dx gets its current dx multiplied by a -1, so it should make a positive negative and a negative positive. And we should turn our vulture's dx, and vulture has a dx as well. Yeah. Vulture's dx gets its current dx times -1, but we also need to do one more thing. We need to reset our x position so that they're not colliding. So we need to say self.x gets, what do we do for this? It's like, do we treat it as if we set our dx? I guess the question is, do we move our player or do we move the vulture? We should probably move the vulture. We say, if our x's are equal, keep the player exactly where it's at, but move our vulture's x to be our self x plus self width. So does that make sense? If we didn't reset this, we could collide, right? Side collide with enemy detected. If we're moving fast enough, the first frame it detects it, we could be multiple pixels in. Then we would swap our dx, and then the very next frame, they could bounce, but they're still colliding, at which point it would swap our dx again, and then it'll just keep swapping 60 frames a second. But what we really want to do is, say we're going fast enough where the first frame we collide, we're overlapping. We're going to reset our vulture to be just not colliding with our player. Then we're going to swap our dx. Then the next frame we're apart, and then we don't have that bug. So I'm going to say that resets vulture x, not resets, but moves vulture x to be not colliding. And it's okay that we're moving this vulture x, because if this is the case, no, hold on. Yeah, we would just be kind of bouncing each other. Yeah, I'd rather move the vulture than move the player. And I don't feel like splitting the difference, if that makes any sense. Like if we detect a collision, I'm not saying, hey, move our player ostrich half the distance of the collision and move our player or our vulture half the distance between the collisions so that they're equally offset, even though that would be a more accurate representation of this. It's just kind of silly to me to have to calculate how far inwards are they overlapping and then move each one appropriately. I feel like we should just detect a collision, bounce the vulture however far he needs to be. Like we're just maintaining our player's X and then shifting the vulture. I think that's okay. Then we're saying if our X is smaller than the vulture, meaning we're higher. And then okay. 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 Sorry guys, I'm just like not having the energy for this. We've got a chunk of it. We're gonna need to add some booleans to our ostrich and vulture class, mainly exploded boolean that we're going to trigger to true if vulture is the case, and then in our render function in our vulture, we need to say if exploded, render the explosion frame, then the egg, and we kind of turn our vulture object into an egg object, that which we then give new physics to upon exploded boolean becoming true, because that's a whole nother story of what is the egg physics once a vulture turns into an egg. Because if you look, it keeps its X position, or keeps its dx a bit, but it bounces off the ground like that. And then after a certain amount of time it hatches, which is a whole nother story. But and our ostrich needs an exploded boolean as well to determine when we switch to our exploded sprites that we made last episode. But my brain is just a little fried now. Tomorrow I'm gonna be coding before noon, because I'm sick of it being late and me yawning through this stuff, and I really need to get some substantial work done. And I think I'll do my best work in the morning before I do my work. So I'm gonna do my best tomorrow to code before noon. But for now, I'm gonna add everything and commit with a message saying started to add enemy side collision. And then I'm gonna get pushed to our origin main and call it a night. Tomorrow, we're gonna work on actually filling in the logic for the bones we kind of outlined for ourselves here. So far, we only have if they collide and they're equal x, swap their dx as long as they're not facing the same direction and they collide with the same x. Because if that's the case, we want, I can't really imagine, since the vultures can't turn around, this is only to see if our joust is hitting the vulture's butt. And if it is hitting the vulture's butt and we're facing the same direction and our x is the same, then I think that should always result in an explosion of the vulture into the egg. So I think we've got a decent outline here. We just need to add the exploded boolean. And then once we add the exploded boolean, we need to update our physics with new stuff. In our player ostrich case, we need to update our physics to stand still because we need to get rid of our dx and just turn into an explosion animation. But if our vulture is exploded, we need to turn our vulture object into an egg sprite that then inherits new physics if that explosion flag is true, because an exploded flag being set to true on a vulture would mean that we are in egg form. And then if we're in egg form long enough, we need to turn into a new vulture, but we actually need to turn into, it's really crazy. It's really cool. The egg will crack after an amount of time and then turn into a little player, an upgraded rider, at which point a new vulture will come running in to pick up that rider, and then that rider becomes a powered up version. A bounder turns into a shadow lord or whatever, and then they're faster and their AI is upgraded at that point. But that's getting ahead of ourselves because we don't even have the bounder logic yet. So yeah, it's like we need a tier system for our vulture class. We need to say, hey, if vulture.bounder, give it the bounder AI. If vulture dot shadow lord, give it a different AI and sprite and whatnot. So we'll have to do that, but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. We just want to see if we can get one vulture to be colliding correctly with our player, and then we need to scale it to multiple vultures. Then we need to scale it to the advanced player upgraded tier system with updated AI. So that's what we got to look forward to. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I'm going to stream earlier tomorrow, and I'm not going to be streaming at 11 p.m. tomorrow like I am today. So I'll see you then.